With the exit from the EU, Great Britain saw itself as a global player, but the dispute with Brussels boils up again. Great Britain, as I said, should become a global player again. With this promise, Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister in 2019. Now, however, the British Prime Minister is making the painful experience. All politics is local. The sharp rise in the cost of living at home and the newly escalated dispute with the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol are overshadowing the appearance of global Britain on the world stage. But Brexit should have completely different goals. In addition to global player and levelling up, there were other plans. One would like to believe it's a joke, but the British Prime Minister is deadly serious. With the rules that have now been passed, he is touching on the basic understanding of democracy. Of course he's a clown. We all know that by now, and he's very aware of it. The constant jokes are a central element of his political appearance. In this way, he tries to make voters believe that he is speaking directly to them, unlike any ordinary politician, and in an old-fashioned slang that makes them feel at home. However, clowns are not always innocent. Think of the Joker in Batman, who's sometimes just a goofy buffoon and at other times a criminal psychopath. The hope was that after the brutal hardships he undertook to bring the UK out of the EU, Boris Johnson would settle down and become a more, normal Tory Prime Minister, a slightly tousled descendant of Harold Macmillan and the One Nation tradition. Then there would be no more purges and at best the usual amount of lies and violations of the law. That is undoubtedly the impression Johnson would like to convey. Empty progress talk with vague hints about a will to, move the country forward. But none. There are grislier tasks at hand of a kind that no Conservative government before him has contemplated. Boris Johnson's personal ambition fits in well with the ambitious programme embarked on by the Tory right, of which Brexit was only the first and most conspicuous proposition. They also hope to reverse the constitutional and administrative reforms of the Blair years. The overarching goal is often described as a kind of national populism of the kind pursued by Trump, Orban, Bolsonaro and Erdogan. Ultimately, it's about restoring the full control over the lower house majority in all areas. It is about a return to Britain's elective dictatorship, as Lord Hailsham, the Conservative Lord Chancellor, called it with brutal frankness in his famous 1976 Dimbleby lecture. Hailsham expected that the danger of an unbridled majority in the House of Commons only existed in a left-wing government. Only Labour governments proudly used their majority as a battering ram of social change. And that's different now. The long march through the institutions is being organized by the right-wingers. Let's look at their marching orders neatly listed in the 2019 Tory manifesto. The manifesto promises, "We will abolish the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act." It has been paralyzing at a time when the country needed decisive action. In March 2022, this promise was more than fulfilled with passage of the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act, which repealed the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which guaranteed there would be a general election every 5 years, as if it never existed. However, the new law promised to do even more. Section 3 contained an exclusion clause intended to ensure judicial non-appealability of the revived prerogative. In other words, no future Supreme Court should be able to overturn the Prime Minister's right to dissolve Parliament. The old uncertainty about whether and when the Queen can turn down a request to dissolve Parliament should be off the table. In the future, the Queen will have to dissolve Parliament on the recommendation of her Prime Minister. She has no other choice. The Prime Minister will then have the absolute right to dissolve Parliament whenever he wants. Before 2011, he had, let's say, 2/3 of that right, but he had to abide by certain etiquette, and that's different now. Similarly, with the right to judicial review, they say, We will ensure that judicial review is available to protect individuals against an overpowering state, which sounds wonderful, but at the same time ensure that this right is not abused to interfere with politics. Pursuing politics by other means or causing unnecessary delays, as they put it. But who decides whether a delay is unnecessary? And what exactly does pursuing politics by other means mean? After the election, of course, there had to be a kind of task force that worked out what these vaguely described dangers might mean in practice. The Fawkes Committee reported in July 2021 that while there were 1 or 2 troubling cases, it couldn't see much that was wrong with the system. However, that was not enough. The Attorney General deliberately misread the report and drafted the Judicial Review and Courts Act. As might be expected, the law claims that it upholds the individual's right to seek legal redress against unfair treatment, but in practice it limits an individual's right to go to court. And it sets a troubling precedent for further restrictions if hardliners decide that the first law doesn't even go far enough. It is to be expected that ministers, emboldened by this new protective cloak, will increasingly be tempted to annotate their laws with reference to yet to be determined bylaws, known as Henry VIII clauses, giving them the power to rule the law in its entirety designed according to their needs. In the past, the legal institution of judicial review provided a fairly decent safeguard against insidious legislation of this kind. In cases of ministerial overreaching, there was a good chance the minister's decision would be overturned by courts. So here we see another opportunity for the Tory government to break the shackles on its power. The UK general election has been remarkably free and fair for a long time, ever since various forms of electoral fraud were finally eliminated in Northern Ireland. Substantial cases of voter fraud have not come to light in any of the recent parliamentary elections. Despite this, the Tory 2019 election manifesto promises, "We will protect the integrity of our democracy by requiring ID to vote, eliminating the collection of absentee ballots, and taking steps to protect against foreign interference in elections." Well, all of these measures now reflected in the Elections Act are an outrageous solution to a non-existent problem. They can only serve one purpose: to discourage voting by the poorer, less organized, and fewer photo ID carrying voters, just like Republicans are doing in the United States. In 2002, when Northern Ireland made photo identification compulsory for voters, the electoral roll shrank by 120,000 people, or 10%. The suspicion is reinforced by a second promise to make it easier for expatriate Britons to vote in the general election, a majority of whom, understandably, are considered Tory voters, while the disadvantaged tend to vote Labour. It is hard to imagine a more shameless strategy for manipulating election results. It may be that the adverse effect will diminish over time as more and more voters have photo ID. What is clear, however, is that the motive behind the design of the electoral law is to give one's own party advantages under the guise of fairness. At the same time, the electoral law also introduces a new structure for the Electoral Commission, which has always been quite independent of the government. Going forward, the law will give the government the power to strategically guide the Commission's work, covering everything from restrictions on campaign funding to the actual conduct of the elections. The Commission rightly notes that its independence is fundamental to maintaining trust in our electoral system. Behind the changes are Tory Brexiteers who are furious at allegations that they broke the law in the 2016 referendum campaign, a charge they were eventually acquitted of. With government support, the Tory right could push the boundaries even further next time. These measures may seem relatively modest and technical to people who are not particularly interested in politics, which is most of us, I guess. However, once the government has the power to impose new rules, it can exert increasing pressure on the shape and size of the electorate, facilitate constituency manipulation, and impose new rules on campaign finance. It looks like this is just the beginning. Then there is the Nationality and Borders Act. In addition to a wealth of other provisions, this law deprives some groups of refugees of the right to family reunification. This is to prevent desperate families from crossing the English Channel in small boats. Instead, their applications are to be processed in some third country, although it's not clear whether this is an effective deterrent. Several cash-strapped states had already rejected this privilege when Rwanda opened its arms in April 2022. This small and depressingly poor African country is recovering from a brutal civil war, and its human rights record remains widely criticized. The thought that such an unfortunate place could deliver the humane treatment promised by Home Secretary Priti Patel is just laughable. Not since British prisoners were crammed into rotting hulls at sea has a British government taken such a callous and dehumanizing attitude. Many provisions of the law are woefully vague and arbitrary. All male asylum seekers who come across the Channel are to be arrested and deported. Critics of this bizarre plan are divided into those who find it impracticable and those who think it's cruel and inhuman, and some think it's both. In his Easter sermon, the Archbishop of Canterbury simply described the project as godless, for which Tory hardliners, who of course like the plan very much, naturally pilloried him. The infamous Section 9 of the Act will allow the Home Office to strip people of their British citizenship, in some cases without notifying them. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees of the UNHCR has said Britain's law is in breach of international law and the Refugee Convention. People can of course protest against all the measures, right? Well, sailing in the same fleet of illiberal legislation is the colossal 300-page Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. Crucial to the law is the power it gives the police to disperse and criminalize public demonstrations for being too loud, even if only one person is present. Of course, the police are their own judges when it comes to the question of what is too loud. In addition to expanding the right to stop and search people without any apparent suspicion, the law gives a bad-tempered police commander free rein to stop people on the street from doing just about anything he dislikes. These 5 laws all came into force at the end of April. They are all intended to increase government control over parliament, over elections, over the courts, over immigrants, and over public demonstrations. There has not been such a legislative attack for more than a century. We have to go back as far as 1819 and the repressive panic that followed the Peterloo massacre to find anything comparable in the form of the 6 acts concocted by Lord Liverpool and his Home Secretary Henry Addington. These laws included restrictions on seditious gatherings, bail to avoid pre-trial detention, blasphemous and seditious insults, with the threats of punitive deportation, and new taxes on newspapers. Some of these laws were later toned down or repealed, but their overall impact is remembered as a low point in the history of British liberty. I can't imagine that one day the 5 acts of 2022 will be looked back on them more kindly. A parliamentary Conservative Party with even the remotest range of opinions would not have conceived, let alone passed, any of these horrible laws. And that's before they go about smashing the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is another breach of international law. And once again, I only can say I'm very, very sorry for the many good people in the UK that are suffering from this government. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.